Good evening. I declare the agenda briefing forum of the 11th of March 2025 held in Council Chambers at Level 2, 388 Hay Street, open at 5:32 p.m. Welcome councillors and staff and the media. On behalf of the City of Subiaco, I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on this evening, and I recognise their ongoing connection to this place. This evening we've got all elected members present in person, so welcome to you all. And the entire executive leadership team here present in person also, ably supported by various staff members who will call on as needed. There's no apologies, and any leave of absence requests we'll deal with next week. Are there any disclosures of interest this evening? Nope. Good. No approved deputations. Yeah, look, I don't think I'll make announcements to an empty room. I think we'll get on to the agenda briefing and work our way through it. Okay, C1, the proposed amendment number 5 to local planning scheme number 5. Questions, councillors? Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. The subject property is in a character area and not within the area targeted for growth. I wonder if it's possible to get a bit of information about how the boundaries of those two areas were determined and what informed that.
Manager Planning Services.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So in the preparation of the city's local planning strategy, it was clear that we wanted to retain the low density character suburbs, and in order to accommodate higher density, we had to identify certain areas. So around the train stations was identified as being a particular area, and also in the town centre more broadly. So yeah, this scheme amendment isn't considered to be consistent with the strategy.
Mr. Petrovsky.
Thank you. I'll just add on a little bit. In determining the areas under the strategy, we looked at the local character either through local heritage surveys that have been done in the past and just the general character of the housing stock and the built form in the area. We also looked at the lot sizes, the yield, and anything else that might inform that. So through that process, we identified some lots had been redeveloped, some were closer to train stations, and as the manager said, they were more appropriate for targeted infill or targeted density. Other areas which are a little bit away from main roads and that had retained that Subiaco character look and feel were then characterised as character areas under our strategy. That was underpinned by a significant community consultation that was undertaken. So that approach absolutely resonated with our community and was based on best practice either through the plans, the heritage surveys, and the other policy documents that we followed. It was also consistent with the state planning framework in the Perth and Peel 3.5 document and a range of other documents as well. So it was all best practice planning that came to that approach.
Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Mayor. I think you must have preempted me almost with that. Yeah, look, I do have a few questions. In the officer recommendation, very high up is the point about this being a complex amendment. Now, the applicants claim that it is a basic amendment. So, essentially, why is it so important, the difference between those two? And probably a second part of the question is, look, it is only one block, so I think, wouldn't there be almost a view in the community that really is, you can't get much more basic than that for an amendment? So, yes, those two, please.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So there's 3 different classifications for a scheme amendment. There's basic, standard and complex. City officers are considering this to be complex as it's inconsistent with the city's local planning strategy. The applicant can form an opinion, a different opinion, and ultimately they can query that with the state government, who can reclassify it in that respect as well. So it is important to classify it correctly in the first instance, and officers have thoroughly considered this against the city's local planning strategy, and we deemed it to be complex.
Just the follow-up of that second bit. I mean, that in the community, sort of, as I said, it's a single block. So, wouldn't people normally consider, well, you can't get much more basic than that?
Mr. Petrovski.
Thanks. The regulations don't actually have a number of lots or sites that are going to be contained in an amendment to be considered under that classification. So it doesn't actually have that as one of the criteria. What the regulations look to do is to consider whether an amendment is consistent with the local planning strategy, which in turn is consistent with state strategy. So it's about the consistency with the broader planning framework. On the other point, if you do have a lot, and if it's just one lot, that could also set an undesirable precedent. So one lot in and of itself is, can be considered on that basis. However, it's the flow-on effect that has to the wider planning approach that the City of Subiaco has in its strategy, which means it's inconsistent with how we're actually trying to plan for the future of Subi. So the number of lots doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you. Look, just moving on then, I think you almost covered this in a part. Why is this application a threat to proper and orderly planning as presented in the officer's report?
Thank you, and through Mayor McMullen. So the city's approach to dealing with infill as part of the local planning strategy and our local planning scheme was to have, targeted infill areas at a higher density, which would adjoin lower density areas. So that can mean you have up to, say, R100 adjoining R15 properties with no medium density interface. So R60, which is proposed as a medium density interface. So we've created a local planning policy suite on the advice of the Minister at the time to deal with the interface issues between high and low density, and we think we've done that quite successfully. This particular amendment wouldn't be subject to Local Planning Policy 1.2, which has, interface provisions. So that in and of itself would present amenity impacts to the broader locality, and as the Director said, it would probably set an undesirable precedent for future scheme amendments that may come up should this one be supported.
So thank you. Just carrying on from that then, is the concern then that if this gets up, it could lead to more spot rezonings?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Potentially, yes.
Okay, thank you. You just mentioned, I think, the local planning policies. Now, from recall, when the previous government imposed the modifications to LPS 5, the Minister said that it was up to the city to develop planning policies that would mitigate any difficulties with the transition zones, I think. Now, local planning policy, I think local planning policy 1 was a result of that. Does that mean that really now we're being asked to undermine our own policy if this amendment is supported?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. We're not being asked by the state, just to make it clear. At the moment, it's a landowner trying to initiate that. We could always amend our local planning policies if it came to it, but what we're trying to say is that orderly and proper planning relates to a proposal's consistency with the established planning framework for an area. We have established the planning framework based on best practice guidelines through the state, our community consultation, and that has sought and gained approval from both council and the state government as well. So what we're trying to say is that this is actually out of step of what we're trying to achieve, and we've got a new planning framework to back that up as well.
Okay, thank you. Just onto the application itself, and it did contain the minister's letter, and the minister's letter to the applicants was inviting them to lodge an application. Does that indicate that there may already be a position by the government if it's actually welcoming and inviting the application for rezoning?
Might take an answer from the director on that one.
Thank you. And through you, Mayor, I don't believe there is a position from the government in that letter. Any local planning scheme amendment proposal would still need to go through a process, and the minister would reserve their decision until the end of that process. At the current state, we don't also have a minister due to the election only having taken place. What I would say is that the state government's position is through its established planning framework, which we are seeking to follow through our scheme and policies.
Thank you. And look, just one other matter. Just before the government went into caretaker mode, on February the 4th, they announced some new pathways for development applications above R30 that could, with certain conditions, go straight to the state planning authority. Would that change in those regulations have any impact on this property, because it is certainly looking to go beyond R30, and it certainly is within 800 metres of a railway station?
Thank you, and through you, Matt. Look, I don't think it will have significant changes, given that there need to be an affordable housing aspect, and the lot size is quite small, so it'd be really difficult to make something stack up to that. And for the for the scale of development that might be achievable on a small residential lot, it's unlikely that this would be an application that would go through the State Development Assessment Unit pathway.
Other questions? Councillor Burns.
Thank you, Mayor McMullen. And let's not take this as support for rezoning, just a little drilling. My question would be this: we seem to be talking about not liking it because, okay, it's we don't want people stepping outside our framework, etc., etc. But can we just get a little, perhaps, site-specific on this, which I think the director touched on just a second ago, and that's what you actually could do on this if we agreed to it. And so I'm looking to discuss, moreover, if we did it, what's the harm involved here? Outside of it sets a bad precedent. Well, and we all know in town planning there isn't any precedent set by doing it once. Doesn't mean we have to do it again. Everything's individually. So can we just drill down on, if we agree to it, what could be built there to start with? Thanks.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So for a site such as this, you're probably looking at about 3-storey, kind of as of right, multiple dwellings. But as I mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be subject to the local planning policy provisions that we have to protect the lower density properties to the east, because it's a separate planning framework, but about 3 stories. But, developers can propose more, and they'll be considered on their merits.
So, if you don't mind me carrying on. So, in light of that, Anthony, if allowing the fact that the Mayor doesn't direct elsewhere, so, all right, let's say we go ahead and we've got 3 stories. And now I can see, arguing against my own previous point, that precedent doesn't exist in planning, but it does allow us to then so what are the prospects of the properties either side saying, well, okay, well, I want a piece of this too, because you're moving forward next door, because here, precedent can play in, just because to say, well, hang on, you're ruining my amenity by doing this next door, so what I'd prefer to do is move out and be a part of it instead. Now, so looking at the sites either side, and perhaps not for my benefit, but for the benefit of the wider public, where do the dominoes start falling?
I think, thanks for the question, and through you, Matt McMillan, I think that the concern is that just there's a gradual erosion of I guess the lower density and the protections that they generally have through our planning framework. So once you do change one domino, you'll probably find that others might start falling as a result of that. So the interface issue is quite critical, and how we've dealt with the interface issue through our planning framework is important in the context of high density versus low density. But what this is seeking to do is introduce medium density, which protections are fairly limited. I'm not sure if the director wants to add any more to that.
Yeah, thank you. And through you, Mayor, in a general sense, when you're considering a local planning scheme amendment, there is a presumption against ad hoc lot by lot density changes, because that essentially goes against why we have a planning system which zones and codes things a certain way. So that's a general planning methodology used throughout planners in the local government and state. It is a little bit different when you are having significant strategic sites where you might want significant development or additional development, or where they stand out. But when you have one residential lot which has been planned for low density residential development, there is no mitigating or differentiating factor that you might have from this and other lots in and around. So if you did rezone this one, then there might be a number of other lots which would then have to be using the same argument to have their land rezoned as well, which is why schemes, zones and densities are applied on more of a street or block basis.
Look, I agree, but okay, so we don't like it. But Section 75, Section 76 tells us you can do it. You know what I mean? So it's, well, you know what I mean? This is not 40 years ago when, you know what I mean, the minister would listen to 2 planning arguments a year if he was lucky, or she. They were all he's at the time. But so what I'm trying to get to is a better reasoning other than we don't like this sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's the old, basically just call it, Councillor Powell stated it, just a word everybody used to hate, spot rezoning. Oh, we're not doing that. Okay. So I'm not speaking in favour of it, but I think in arguing it's not appropriate because it sets a bad trend, you know, all these general things, I think all we're doing is driving it towards 76. I'd like to know it's not good on its own, because, you know, the report should be reading, you do this, you get 3 stories, next door is then going to, you know what I mean, drop an application in, now we're going to put 2 blocks together, et cetera, et cetera. This is why it's wrong, not it's just, you know what I mean, outside the planning framework, Bolton scale, you know what I mean, all these old terms that have been, you know, been dashed around forever. That's all I'm saying, is I'm not reading site-specific reasoning, and the Act states that these people have every right to ask for it, and if we just say no thanks, then it just goes straight to the minister under a 76. Thanks. Anyway, so I suppose it's not even a question really. I'm just saying that's where I see it going.
The thing is, we're here to ask questions, but what I've heard so far is advice that says that a whole planning process led to the existing planning scheme, and there were reasons for the density put where it was. And I think the planning advice is not that we don't like ad hoc spot rezoning just because, that the advice is that it would be inconsistent with orderly and property planning because of the process that led to the current scheme and the zones therein. That's what I've heard. Is there anything that the planning staff can add, or is that essentially the crux of it, that planning schemes happen for a reason and spot rezoning to some extent is really just a landowner asking for what they want because they're not happy with what's in the scheme?
Essentially, that's a good summary. What I would say is that 76 that section of the Act is really useful when a local government doesn't have an updated planning scheme. So if it's sat on its hands for a long time, 10, 20, 30 years, and done nothing, there's a greater argument to have a Section 76 order issued, even just to test the principle of what is being proposed. And given that our scheme is relatively new, I think that argument would fall away.
Just on that, before I go to someone else, there's something in the executive summary which I don't quite understand. It's the third dot point from the bottom, and I think there might be something grammatical that needs tending to, but it says the risk of not progressing with the amendment managed by the city is managed. Okay, so the risk of not progressing with the amendment is managed by the city having a contemporary planning framework, etc. Okay. Any other questions? Councillor De Vries.
Through you, Mayor. Just in terms of the significant development pathway, which we know is now going to be possible if you're 800 metres within a railway station, I presume this will go to Director for Development. Just does that mean the local planning scheme can be completely ignored? Because I understood from the research I did recently that even though it's going to be zoned R60 and then there's height limits, that those height limits could be ignored and WAPC could say, okay, it's okay if you go to 10 stories. Is that incorrect? And is there still some protection under our local planning scheme? Because my research seemed to indicate that there wouldn't be that level of protection, and it would override our planning instruments such as LPS 5. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. While I think an application for a small residential lot through the SDAU is very unlikely, in the event that we got there, the Planning Commission would still need to give due regard to our local planning schemes and controls. So nothing's just thrown out the window, but it is less control for the city, obviously, because we're not writing that report and liaising with the applicant. But our scheme would still apply.
Just to follow up, if I may, the reason a small lot like this wouldn't go to the SDAU would be because why? Firstly, there'd be greater fees involved, and secondly, you'd actually have to have a plan to develop the property. You wouldn't just be seeking a spot rezoning for the reasons we think is motivating this one.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. Yeah, so the SDAU process is different to the normal planning process. The fees are substantially higher, which might deter people from wanting to pursue that pathway. As the director said, the lot is relatively small. It's not typical for a SDAU type application. That doesn't mean that one won't necessarily be lodged, but there are different reasons why someone might pursue that particular pathway over, say, a DAP or go through council.
I just add on to that as well. From a commercial point of view, given the size of the lot, there's only so much you can fit on there. So having a return on investment of having a pretty simple, subdivide and develop is probably going to be much more of an appetite for a developer coming in and doing that, given that the development and built form potential is limited on such a small lot.
Finished? Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Matt. I'm just pondering sites like that are adjacent to potentially large developments. Are we risking in future these places becoming effectively derelict because nobody wants them, because they're zoned so low? I'm just sort of trying to go forward. Do we want to keep it this way? If I were an owner there and its value had dropped away completely, am I going to invest in maintaining places like this? are we risking creating zones where people don't want to develop because they're so restricted on the small site adjacent to something really large?
Thank you. Director, Development Services.
Look, I don't think these sorts of places are going to be derelict, and from our review of data, house values in Subiaco haven't gone down recently. What I would say is that the community's approach and our approach was having high density next to low density, and to manage that transition through our built form and our local planning policies. So what we've tried to do in our local planning policy is to say that if a high density development is next to a low density lot, you can only really have one story above from what that low density lot is developed. So if that single house is at 2 stories, then in that interface and that little bit next door, they can only go up to 3 stories, and they might be pushing the built form somewhere else. So that's how we've worked to graduate the scale of development in sites. Subi's approach is different because it does have high density next to low density, and that was deliberate by the community, by the feedback, to maintain our low character areas and our heritage areas as well. In other areas, they have taken another approach where they have more R40, R50 and R60 density. However, we see that in Perth that's actually led to a lot of battle axe subdivision, like demolition and clearing of sites, clearing of trees, and I don't want to say cookie cutter houses, but quite standard housing. So we've taken a different approach. We're trying to protect heritage and character, what Subi has about it, but we still do want development just in those targeted sites. We don't need that development and middle zoning creep.
I'll take the opportunity. Just thinking about risk, let's assume that there's broad support for the officer recommendation, which is not to support the amendment. What's the risk of following the advice? I'm looking through the risk section of the report, and I can see there's a procedural risk that if we resolve not to adopt the amendment, there's a risk that the landowner could go to the minister, and the minister might make an order under Section 76. We're in no worse a position in that situation, are we, than if we, for some nebulous reason, decided to go against your advice and resolve something differently? Am I understanding the purpose or the effect of Section 76 correctly? There'd still need to be advertising. All the minister would be doing would be ordering us to follow the procedural steps to progress the amendment, but they wouldn't actually be approving and forcing the amendment upon us at that point.
That's correct.
Okay. Doesn't seem very risky. Any other questions? Councillor Powell.
I'd just like to follow up on Councillor Bree's question. And that is that it is possible that if this rezoning goes ahead and they provide some affordable housing, that this application may not come to the council at all. They may completely bypass the council and go straight to state planning. Is that correct? And sorry, and just it mightn't be exactly the same, but we have quite a number of properties from the rezoning that are zoned above R30 and are within 800 metres of a railway station. Is this going to affect them as well? So, you know, could this property be the springboard for others?
I think through the Mayor, the correct answer is anything that's over R30 and has affordable housing could go to the STAU. Again, I would reiterate that for a single residential lot of this nature, it is highly unlikely.
Councillor De Vries, was that a question?
Oh, no, it's okay.
Anyone else? Councillor Burns.
whether or not I explained myself from what I was driving at before, I don't quite know. But so I'll just pose it as a question: Is it possible between now and becoming before us in a week to actually have a better understanding of individually why this is a bad idea, not collectively why it's a bad idea? You looked, the mayor seems confused. I'll explain that better. That why the dangers of this site, as opposed to us not wanting to see this sort of stuff happening everywhere. I just like it. Just to me, the report doesn't talk about the property. It talks about Subiaco. So the question is, could we have more site-specific, which I think, and I don't know if I'm getting on board with what Councillor Powell might be talking about, but just, okay, I'll frame it another way. I could take this answer and apply it to any property that came along in a generally close to a train station, same sort of size. You could just take this as a a standard answer. I'd like an answer about this particular property, its size, what's next to it, what could happen, why we don't like it, as opposed to this, as opposed to, anyway. Is that part? Could I get site-specific information between now and next Tuesday?
Director or manager, is that possible?
Thank you. And through you, Mayor, I understand the premise of the question. So we'll take that on board and we'll see if we can provide more information on that, with the premise of the question being about taking away the precedent argument, because we're considering each site on its merits.
Seeking more protection to our stock than looking for a way to resolve that it should be approved. Okay, because I'm not particularly, I know the site, I'm not in favour of it, but I'd like a slightly different documentation. Thanks very much. I appreciate your answer.
Anyone else? Councillor O'Connor.
Yes, just sort of following up what Councillor Burns has said in some respects. The property is one of the residents in that Shenton Park precinct that reflects that development period from 1900 to 1939. It's a character area. Is there any protection of that property?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. So it's not on the city's heritage list or in a heritage area. We are currently reviewing our local heritage survey in Shenton Park. So I'm not sure if this one's been identified as possibly being worthy of inclusion on that, but there's no statutory heritage protection.
Okay, I think that's probably the end of the questions from councillors, if I've read the room. Thank you. We'll move on. C2, the City of Nedlands draft Mount Claremont Master Plan referral for comment. Any questions on C2? Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you. Look, the proposals about increasing density near the Shenton Park train station, I think north of the train station, where there's at present in light industry, is being earmarked for maximum density, I think, really. How is that, first off, how is that going to affect the city? Because it is, and Shenton Park Railway, because it is just on the other side. railway line. It's directly abuts us. And in association with the increased density that we're also getting with Montario Quarter, what sort of strain is that going? Could that in the future put on our infrastructure and traffic transport in that area?
Manager Planning Services.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMahon. So this particular document, the master plan, is not a statutory document, so it's quite high level and visionary. It doesn't go into the detail of density necessarily and heights and the like. So one thing that was done when we were asked to comment, we obviously referred it internally to all the relevant departments, including engineering, who's provided some high level comments, and that's contained within attachment 1 about things that Nedlands should consider as part of more detailed planning if they get to the point of, I guess, detailed structure planning, etc. So will there be impacts? Probably if there's going to be more development in the area. But what we're asking for Nedlands to do is to work with the city to manage those issues, and we've identified them in attachment 1 at a high level that they can start thinking about those things before they get into the formalities of or the formal process of making more detailed plans.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. C3, the area-wide 40 kilometre per hour speed zoning. Councillor White.
What's the argument against doing this?
Do we have a staff member who wants to argue against themselves? Manager, director, what's the opposing argument?
Thank you. It's a rather interesting question, and almost to say it's entering into debate. Almost, I'd say, but there's not a lot of arguments against it. I think probably the main argument, and we do touch on it in some of the documents, would just be about, I think, travel time. But given the size of Subiaco and the overall inner city area, and given the network's already fairly delayed, so you don't have a straight run through most roads as it is, that's not a very strong argument. It's something that we've looked into and has been assessed in the trial in Vincent and shown that typically that only results in a few seconds of added delay to a trip. So that would probably be the most compelling reason. I mean, I can't think of many others. I don't know, Colin, did you have anything else to add?
I did ask this question about, on our longest road, what would the impact be if there was no traffic on it, and the most that it would take on that longest road, and we have traffic on our road, so it's a pretty strange question, but would be 30 seconds. So that would be the difference if you're able to be at 40 and 30. So it generally is around that perception on the likely lower speeds, and therefore the likely longer time is generally that, as opposed to all the other arguments about both safety of the users versus the community as well on those residential streets.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to create a debate, but I mean, partly because the report suggests that everyone's doing this anyway. Some of the statistics that are presented suggest that most people aren't getting above the speed limit, and so I guess I'm thinking, well, personally, I think it's a good idea, but I'm just trying to think, well, why it seems fairly compelling that we should be doing this, and but if people are already doing it, is there a need, and I was just trying to sort of prepare myself, I guess, for the discussion in terms of it makes a lot of sense that I can't try. If I was trying to put myself on the other side, what's the argument against it? That we're regulating something that's already being done, or that, that's it. In case you've got any further comments, but without having a debate.
I take your point. I mean, I'll guess I can give a bit of comment. You're right. it is a very common trend, probably more internationally than in Australia, but it is going that way in Australia. You might have even seen a report in Victoria where Infrastructure Victoria are actually recommending large swathes of Melbourne be reduced. So this is a common approach that's been done in a lot of metropolitan cities. It makes a lot of sense in the Perth context. Whilst we are a very car-dominant environment, we are obviously looking towards a more moving-in-place approach, and this goes hand in glove with that approach that the city's looking to do with projects like Subi Streets, and it's a broader approach that we share with a lot of other surrounding local governments. So, and it makes sense to do it in a consistent approach rather than just to spot one suburb. Given Subiaco is not particularly big geographically, it makes sense to do it in a larger group. So that's probably just a bit of context as far as you're quite right. It's a common trend. A lot of places doing it and have been getting good results from it. So the counter argument's a pretty hard one to come up with.
Sorry, last question. I was a little bit unsure about the definitions. It talks about in local roads, and then it talks about local access roads and local distributor roads. How are these defined?
Thank you. You're right. It is a fairly technical term that Main Roads uses, and obviously we have to go through. And if this recommendation was approved by council, we'd have to seek approval from Main Roads, and obviously this is the class. They have a road hierarchy classification. So typically, they've got different names for the different hierarchy of roads. So an access road would be typically a quieter street with lower volumes that's primarily for servicing residential properties. And then as you go up to a local distributor, that's maybe a road like Onslow Road, which whilst it still has residential properties, it starts servicing activity centres and has more traffic. And then you go up to higher orders, which are local distributors A and B. We're not considering that for this. That'd be roads like Thomas Street, Railway Road, which obviously serve a very important movement function. So we're not suggesting that be included as part of the area-wide speed reduction. So really, access roads is really primarily a residential. Local is the next step up, still residential, but a bit more movement function. And if you want to see the specifics, attachment 2 has a color coordination to show which roads are classified as what. But that'd be generally how they're classified and what they are.
Councillor De Vries.
Yeah, excuse me if this information is in the documentation through you, Mayor, to the Director for Technical Services. Obviously, as this progresses and rolls out, there'll be, a lot of streets that get impacted and in a positive way. Would that reduce the need for speed bumps? Like, for example, my favourite example, Stubbs Terrace, where 50 is the speed limit, but it is really becoming quite a busy road, and a lot of risks happening around the McCullum intersection. So, yep.
Thank you. Yes, so it is touched on in some of the draft materials we have as attachment 1, but the approach would generally be to, if this was approved, obviously it'd be a blanket reduction for the most part, but we're aware that there are going to be some roads, whether it's through design, their use, where that might not be complied with. And so there may well still be, I suspect there still will be some cases and some roads where you will need to do a physical intervention of some kind. So we're not ruling that out, but hopefully, and as we've seen with area-wide reductions elsewhere, for the most part, you get pretty good compliance. Subiaco's overall traffic speeds are quite good, given the environment naturally is conducive to that. So there will be some locations, in summary, but hopefully fewer locations that you need to do expensive civil interventions for.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor McMullen. Some of our outer roads, excuse for not using the technical term for them, but like Thomas Street, are very busy already. If we imagine that a 40 kilometre speed limit might be a bit of a disincentive for people to come through Subiaco and to go around it instead, which I think would be a good thing, how able to cope with perhaps extra capacity are those other roads around the outside? And I'm thinking of Thomas Street, which is backed up almost all the way down to Nicholson from Hay at various times of the day.
Thank you. And I might throw to Randir in a second just to add some commentary to this. But I think the most important thing is, because this is an area-wide approach, one of the benefits of that is you don't have this situation where you maybe put out spot fires, where you maybe make one isolated location or road slow, and then that might incentivize an alternative route. Because you're doing area-wide reductions, that's less likely to happen. And then I guess it's the answer to your question is kind of inherent in the premise of the question as well, that those roads that are so congested, people avoid already currently. So there's not likely to be a great amount of extra vehicles going on to the likes of Thomas and Railway Road just because of the conditions, particularly at peak times. So I wouldn't think there'd be a big redistribution. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Randy?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Through you, Mayor McMullen. Look, the only thing I'll add there is we talked about this aligning with that movement in place framework, and the purpose of having that whole road hierarchy is to actually have your traffic volumes on your higher order roads. So taking an area-wide approach means people have choice to either follow the congested routes or actually travel to the speed limits in your local roads as well. So I'd say Thomas is a good and a bad example in terms of spare capacity. The other streets surrounding our city, there seems to be enough capacity to be able to cater for some redistribution of traffic. We don't expect that to be massive, though. Thank you.
Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. Look, the Premier and the newly elected Premier and the opposition leader before the election both made clear that they're not in support of 40-kilometre overall limit. So are we really just flogging a dead horse, because I've already indicated they're not going to support it?
Thank you, Councillor, and for you, Mayor. So I know the comments you're referring to in the run-up to the most recent state election, and I think there was terms like not supporting arbitrary speed limit reductions, and I think the question was more broadly across all of Perth, not just the inner city's proposal here. And I know the Premier at the time was, Premier still, the Premier was quoted that he just needed to be convinced and that there needed to be evidence to support this. And hopefully what comes through the report and the attachments and what we've said here is there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports this kind of proposal. And that includes state documents like the overall statewide road safety strategy that both Main Roads and the Road Safety Commission do a lot of their planning and around. And I guess further to that, as far as sentiment on the proposal, it's important to say that through the steering group for this project, so the Perth Inner City Group have got members from Main Roads, including the manager for for traffic management, who is the one who's delegated for approving speed limit reduction. So he's been involved through this process and has been very comfortable with the approach that's been taken to date. And the Premier's long said that's something that has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, evidence-led, and with Main Roads, and that's what we've done to date.
I think if I could, through the Chair, yeah. One of the things I probably just wanted to add is it's not unusual for premiers and those that wish to be a premier to be doorstopped on that and not have all the information. But I think the Premier's comments were clear that he wanted the evidence to lead the community consultation, and that's what this process is about. And he also talked about it's really important we have a conversation with Main Roads. So he certainly was not aware that we've had many conversations with Main Roads, and they've been through this process, as well as the Road Safety Commission. So, and they're looking to fund it, this proposal. So he certainly wouldn't have been aware of that, nor would the Leader of the Opposition. So, and he said specifically that if there were specific proposals, would be supported if the evidence was there. And that's what we've got before us.
Burns.
Thank you. I'm going to presume this is going to the director, but as you see fit, Mayor. I might just take it and just you can tell me where I'm wrong. So it's not an open-ended question. This is not going to capture railway. It shouldn't capture Roberts. It won't capture Thomas. I'm going to presume it's going to capture Hay from Thomas to railway. But once you get outside, if you cross railway on Hay, you're going to head towards 60, but not until you get into Daglish, maybe. So that's probably the only one. So if I'm wrong in any of those, it's probably only where it's going to grab Hay Street, or tell me I'm wrong completely, and then I'll pose my next question.
So, through you, Mayor. So you're quite right. Most of the first few roads you listed, the typical boundary roads, the likes of Thomas Roberts, that serve a big movement function, and they're neither an access or a local distributor road, which are the only ones we're seeking approval for with this report. They're not included, so their speed limits would remain unchanged. Around Hay Street, again, that's a similar situation. That would be unchanged because that's a higher order road. So really, this is going to be just our access roads and then local distributors, which is a few of the likes of Onslow Road and Nicholson and I'm just trying to give you a few examples off the top. But those kind of roads. But it's all covered in attachment to the report.
Thank you. Look, I probably should be just sending a email on this, but I'm going to pose it anyway. The diagram map, the one with the two cars and the people on page 18. Look, it's pretty obvious, it's a J-curve, because if the amount of people that are going to drop dead if the car's travelling at 0 is going to be none, okay? And at the speed of light, I suppose they're going to be disintegrated, so it's an incremental J-curve. So I accept in this part of the J-curve the number doubles, which arguably would be the J-curve's elbow. Is it possible to understand instead how many less people are going to be hit between the number, not actually their likelihood of survival? Wouldn't that be more appropriate to understand if this is about safety, that it's just what's the number, and do we have that access to that information? I suppose. Pardon? I'm talking about something else. I'm moving away from the likelihood of death to how many less people are going to be hit. Thanks.
Thank you for your question, for you, Mayor. So I take the point. So you're right. There's two questions here. One's the severity. So like you touched on, the faster an object is hitting something, the more severe the outcome of that. So and like you said, that's fairly common sense, hopefully, to most people. The second, what you're getting at, is like the likelihood of being hit in the first place. And you're right. As speeds go down, that likelihood decreases. I sent something, I think, last night, which showed typically as vehicle speeds go down by about 1K, for each K they reduce, the likelihood of an accident occurring drops by about 3%. And then also in the attachment we've got here, attachment 1, we also talk about the experience in Vincent and other locations which have been observed, and a similar sort of thing is played out there, that about a 1%, for each 1% reduction in speed traveled, average speed traveled, the likelihood of an accident reduced by about 2.4%. So if you can imagine, if we reduce close to the 10%, the kind of reduction that could equate to is in accidents that occur in the first place, and when they do happen, obviously the severity would more often than not be a lot less severe.
Councillor De Vries.
Yeah, through you. I suppose this isn't so much a question, so I shouldn't really say it, but just through the recent tragic accident that happened on Jutland Parade, I think, is there an increasing awareness now of the incredible risk to the community without these kind of traffic measures? I mean, it's kind of a Dorothy Dixer really, but I think that has really made, I'm sure, the Premier think clearly on this issue. Perhaps it's a question through you.
I don't know. Is the Premier thinking about this situation at the moment? I don't. Who can say? Who in this room can say? Probably no one. The same way JD's not thinking about him at the moment. Okay, I don't see a huge flurry of hands in the room, so I think we're probably at the end of that agenda item. So, councillors, I think we'll move on. C4, the tender for the supply and delivery of waste trucks. Okay, I'm thinking possibly not, but any questions from the floor? C5, the mid-year budget review. Okay, I think that's probably a no as well. There will be another public agenda item next week at C6, the financial statements and reports, but they're still being finalised. So that would bring us to the end of the public agenda. There will be a confidential item next week regarding the CEO review process, but for the purpose of tonight's briefing, we can call it a close. So I'll declare the agenda briefing forum closed at 6:27 p.m. Thanks, councillors, and thank you, staff.